Hi kids, welcome to the next section of Aviation History. We're up to the end of the Pacific War. The U.S. tried to support troops fighting in China against the Japanese by air. Unfortunately, that meant they had to fly over the Himalayan mountains into China. That was called flying the hump, and there's the Hump Flyers Association and a number of good books on that subject. As the U.S. advanced closer and closer to the Japanese islands, capturing islands as they went, they used these as bomber bases to attack the Japanese homeland. Well before the war, the B-29 had been conceived as an aircraft to provide long-range bombardment in places like the Pacific where there were no close bases. So this was going to be a long-range, high-altitude bomber needed for long-range flights in the Pacific. It took a long time to develop, but it was the first bomber to be pressurized and have remotely operated power turrets. So this is a pretty sophisticated aircraft, pretty sophisticated engines, the Wright R-3350s. It was said that the B-29 was one of the best three-engine bombers in the world because it often came back with three engines running. So they first operated from India and China and were not effective immediately. Like the first air battles in World War II in Europe, the crews were not well trained, they didn't have experience, and as they went along, they learned as they went. Later, the B-29s began to operate from the island bases as they were captured, islands like Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. Japanese industry was much more dispersed than the German industry. It was more difficult to find and hit, and there weren't specific targets that were necessarily worth attacking. Therefore, high-altitude precision bombing really was not as effective as it was in Germany. Curtis LeMay took command of the bomber offensive in Japan in early 1945. And when LeMay commanded the subsequent B-29 attacks against Japan, he mostly used incendiary attacks on 67 different cities during the rest of the year. Those bombings included the later atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One specific raid that should be mentioned is the firebombing of Tokyo, called Operation Meeting House, on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. That raid, the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th of 1945, proved to be the single most destructive bombing raid of the war, killing more people in the individual raid than those were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For this first attack against Tokyo, LeMay ordered the defensive guns removed from the B-29s, 325 of them, and loaded each plane with Mach or Model M47 incendiary cluster bombs, magnesium bombs, white phosphorus, and napalm. And instead of flying at 20,000 feet, they flew in streams at 5,000 to 9,000 feet over Tokyo. The first Pathfinder flights flew over Tokyo just after midnight on March 10th and marked the area with a big X in flame. In a 3-hour period, the main bombing force dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries, killing on the order of 100,000 civilians, destroying 250,000 buildings, and incinerating 16 square miles of the city.
We had a wonderful piece of equipment, that B-29. It was really a step up in advancement of aircraft from the old B-24s and B-17s you wouldn't believe. If it's just a better airplane, bigger and better, I'd have to say. It'd carry a huge bomb load. It was pressurized. We'd sit up very high altitude or wherever we were, shirt sleeves, smoking cigarettes, communicating back and forth with the guys in the back. You know, we had a crew of 11, and we had a tail gunner. That guy was something else. He had to stand in that very small compartment back on the back of that thing. We had some missions that were 14 hours, and most of them were in the 12-hour range. That's a long time to sit back there. He couldn't leave as long as we were pressurized. But when we got down to lower altitudes coming home, finally why he could crawl back out of the tube and come in there. But that was a tough position, I thought. We got a flight coming up, and we got our crew together, and we went on that horrible fire raid, March the 9th raid. I've forgotten how many planes they put over that, well over 100, I'm sure. We were scheduled in about, I would say 3 o'clock in the morning for our part of the target. We got to the target, and the bombardier dropped the bombs. We hit our target, and we got out of there and made it safely home, obviously. I tell you, the fires were burning so bright, you could almost read a paper in the cockpit. We were at 7,000 feet. The result of that fire was 16 square miles of Tokyo destroyed, burned, and probably close to 100,000 civilians killed in this thing. Why did we do that? Japan had what was called a cottage industry of building things. This little home over here, a group of people would build parts, say the wheels or tires or assemble whatever pieces for the Zero or whatever they were doing. This little guy over here would do this. And the first thing you know, they had enough stuff put together, they could make a Zero over here somewhere. Now that's a crude way of saying it, but their thought was we needed to destroy that to reduce their effectiveness as to air defense, and it worked. It was a devastating. Frankly, I think it was worse than Hiroshima.
So later in the war, we'll see the use of the atomic bomb, which clearly one airplane, one bomb, but we had already had with 300 bombers the ability to wipe a city off the map. Air crews at the tail end of the bomber stream on the Tokyo raid reporting the stench of burning flesh that was permeating the aircraft over the target. Precise figures are not available, but the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, directed by LeMay between March of 1945 and the Japanese surrender in August of 1945, may have killed more than 500,000 Japanese civilians and left 1 million homeless. Estimates from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey done after the war estimated about 220,000 people were killed. Some 40% of the built-up areas in 66 cities were destroyed, including much of Japan's war industry. LeMay's tactics devastated Japan. U.S. logisticians had a rough time just keeping LeMay supplied with bombs. By the summer of 1945, there were few targets even worth attacking by air, but there were several cities which had not been attacked by air deliberately so that we would have basically fresh targets to test the new atomic bombs on. On the 6th of August 1945, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr. dropped one atomic bomb on Hiroshima from a B-29 he named Enola Gay in memory of his mother. The uranium bomb was called Little Boy and had never been tested. 3 days later, on the 9th of August 1945, Major Sweeney dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki from a B-29 called Boxcar. This plutonium bomb had only been tested once on the 16th of July 1945 at the Trinity site in New Mexico. Again, these two raids destroyed both cities, but still weren't the worst raids in the war. The Japanese surrendered on the 14th of August of 1945. The end. My cat wants to go out.